Leadership and poetry. Finding a woman's voice. I'm somewhere between a womanist and your wife. Divinely designed to birth nations, speak life into every situation because I know my prowess isn't my power. I choose to walk in lonely hours, cry silent across creaking floors and wipe away fear. I was meant for this. Twist in my hips, seated regal, community strength, flying like seagulls against the wind. I found my voice when my grandmother stood me in front of the church after many rehearsals. I stood there, nervously reciting 4 lines. Although it may seem familiar to many, poetry took me on a very different journey. It molded me. I found a solace in memorization and performance. I became those words. I was no longer a puny child. I was larger than single parenthood. I was stronger than the bullies. I was a leader. There's no irony in the inspiration. Storytelling, griot, and recitation are rich traditions in the African American tradition. It kept our history alive when literacy was illegal. My family's legacy flew in the face of history. My great-grandmother and her sister were both college educated. My grandmother, too, graduated and taught. My mother was an art teacher. Teachers use stories to emphasize a variety of themes and points. Poetry was just another way to tell a story. Church nurtured gifts that public school teachers may not appreciate. It provided a stage where a precocious and sickly child could do something that didn't cause injury. Public speaking became my basketball or soccer. I went miles in several counties reciting poems about heaven's grocery store or the cross in my pocket. I had props. It was amazing to command a church full at age 10. I wasn't starstruck. It's what I did. But I wanted to do more than read. So I began to write. I wrote songs. I wrote poems to every relative, birthdays and holidays. They found joy in the rhymes and encouraged me. When my grandmother passed, I lost my love of performing. It was less of a tribute and more like a chore. At 14, the source of hope and leadership joined the ancestors and defeated cancer. I watched her body join her in-laws. My pencil wrote nothing. Poetry was not on my agenda. My goals were to finish 9th grade. In the midst of my misery, I was given the greatest gift. My music teacher had me read. She told me to find I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. In those pages, my story paled, and I could live again, as I had in all of my favorite books. I heard someone new. I was validated. I was as much as she was. In a space where I questioned my existence, Maya Angelou encouraged me. I wrote for the literary magazine Tides at my high school and stayed close to the librarians. I found joy in rooms full of books and card catalogs. I was published. I was okay. My voice trickled onto pages and stood out more than my complexion. I was nurtured. My poems turned into songs and became a part of a stage production. My words were taken seriously by a complete stranger. It was then that I decided that poetry could be more. As unorthodox as it was, I determined to leave my small town and fine-tune my writing skills. I majored in creative writing and philosophy. My concentrations were poetry and metaphysics. There was something missing. Class after class, my voice grew stale, stuck. Nikki Giovanni, Sonia Sanchez, and Toni Morrison were not on my reading list. I was angry, young, gifted, and black. I knew Lorraine Hansberry. I was in love with Langston Hughes. I heard none of my familiar unless I read them on my own. I wrote anyway. I worked to make my voice fit into spaces where it had yet to be heard. The struggle was more than philosophical. I was being erased. I sought out any voices that would listen. Thankfully, they did. I graduated with an unjust fear of following my dreams. I wrestled with my choices. I ran away until I found Audre Lorde in a California bookstore. At 22, poetry found me again, selling books and magazines door to door. She moved me. She yelled at me. In every page, she solidified why poetry is not a luxury. Poetry stays with you and shows up. It leads you. You don't control it. Submission to the gift makes it easier, but will not resolve the rocky road. Her collection moved with me from state to state until I found home. Poetry wrote out marriage and new parenthood, divorce, and first professional job. Poetry became a menace when I enlisted in the U.S. Coast Guard, distracting me from duty and demanding submissions. I'm grateful. My poems were published throughout my enlistment. With every new poem, I dared to still dream of my collection. Carrying years of poems is as heavy as too many clothes. Every move meant more journals. Poetry isn't practical or paying the bills. Poetry was getting on my nerves. Since teaching was in the family and I was broke, I decided to get certified or at least begin the process. Thankfully, my professor, a poet, sat me down and told me not to do it. Again, poetry rescued me from myself and led me out. I learned that poetry can be profitable as spoken word artists became good friends. They worked their craft, creating multiple streams of income through performances and CDs. In time, I went from behind the mic to managing events. I was still incomplete. Until last year, my poems were scattered online and in a few publications. My stacks and stacks were just papers without a theme or binding until a chance meeting. A complete stranger challenged me to gather my best work in 34 days as my mother lay dying. Poetry gave me a new life and a book all my own. Although she never saw it, she taught me no sacrifice is too great for your art. The naysayers will be your audience. There is peace in every letter, every poem, a piece of you. Poetry is motherhood magnified. I give birth on a daily basis. I too am a doula. Poetry comes through children. It laughs with the elder ladies in a book club. It stands nervously being shared for the first time. We are all undiscovered poets looking for pen, paper, or a microphone. Leadership is more than the certificates you earn. The corners of those pages will yellow, fade. Your gifts will always speak for you. I was fortunate to have poetry as a foundation, words leading me beyond limitations. Every time, poetry prepared me for my next step. Poetry sang me to sleep. Poetry played with me. It guided my prayers and made me smile. It wrote mottos that echo in everything I do. Poetry taught me tenacity and kept me focused. When my life was torn apart, poetry chronicles my solace. It stood up to my rapists. It counted every kick. It dispelled every myth and made me. It celebrates and defines me. I am poetry. I lead from within. I write my her story in poetry.